Hub, through connection and collaboration, we seek to accelerate the Australian EdTech sector globally. We were founded in 2016 by leading Australian universities and corporations. I thank Charles Sturt University, Deakin University, Griffith University, La Trobe University, Monash University and Navitas for their leadership in founding EduGrowth to ensure that Australia plays a central role in the digitisation of education around the world. Today's webinar is presented in partnership with Deloitte and Austrade. We'll be looking at the details of the 2019 EdTech Census and then turn to the opportunity for all through the EdTech and innovation sector globally. So without further ado, I would like to acknowledge and welcome the partners that we are working with today, but I now can't move my slide. Just one second. Here we go. Here's a little bit better. Okay, so Christine Axton is Director of Education Strategy from Deloitte. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you, David.
We have Rebecca Hall, Head of International Education Centre of Excellence at Austrade. Welcome, Rebecca. And we have Sophia Lynn, a Consultant Digital Customer Strategy and Experience Designer at Deloitte. Thank you,
Thanks, David.
Sophia. Do you want to share your screen, Sophia, so we can get some slides up?
Yeah, let's jump into it.
And welcome Christine from Deloitte, who is joining us today. And actually, in fact, it's fantastic for us to be able to publicly welcome you as a strategic partner of EduGrowth. So thank you very much, Christine.
Thank you, David. And yeah, we're really excited to be able to talk through some of the EdTech Census results from 2019 with you today. I'm very excited to be partnering with EduGrowth. As some of you might know, we have been doing the EdTech Census in conjunction with EduGrowth since 2017. We first put out a census in 2017 and we refreshed it earlier this year with the 2019 census. And we'll also be looking to do a census again this year to see what's changed in the EdTech market. So before we get in, what we really, I'm sorry, I'll just hand to David to just talk through the census methodology.
Yeah, so as Christine said, in 2017, we did our first census of the Australian EdTech sector. And it's really important data and research to sort of try and help us understand what activity is happening in the sector. And it helps inform policy and it helps inform the stakeholders that are in our sector that can really help us grow it. So in 2019, we actually collected some data. We used a SurveyMonkey model, and essentially we had invited people to participate. So it wasn't just a free-for-all, we were specifically targeted in who we spoke to. And I think we had 160 something. Let me look at the slide, 168 responses. Did you want to add anything in there, Christine, about the data we collected?
I suppose the really interesting thing is that and I think we can talk a little bit more about this as we go through some of the EdTech Census results from 2019. But what's lovely is to actually see the change since 2017. So I think in 2017 we had we estimated there were approximately 350 EdTech startups in Australia. And in 2019, we saw that there were 600 EdTech startups in Australia. So it's really lovely to see some of the changes, and we'll be able to talk through a bit more of what we've seen in the data later on.
Fantastic. And now I think Sophia is going to help us do a survey, yeah?
That's right. So one of the things that we thought might be really interesting to do today is actually to look at if we could get the EdTech organisations who are online to respond to our Menti poll. We'd like to just take a quick pulse check of what you see as your biggest challenges today, and then we might reflect on how those relate to what we saw in the 2019 survey. So I'll hand over to Sophia to take you through that.
If you just head to the web link www.menti.com and you pop in the code 563947, you'll be invited to answer this question. You should have some multiple choice options on your screen, and I'll just give people a couple of minutes to jump on and give us the answers.
Whilst people do this, we might actually have a little quick conversation around this, Christine. I think this is one of the interesting questions that we actually asked people in the census in 2017 and 2019, didn't we?
It is, and it's exactly we've got exactly the same multiple choice answers on offer today, and it is very interesting to see as we look at the live results coming in, that it's very consistent with 2019. So the majority of, so the highest response in the 2019 survey with 26% was finding customers. And the second and third were expanding internationally and finding talent. So finding talent, I guess, is actually reduced, which we might expect that might have happened. And finding investment is now, judging by the results, coming in at number 3. But the first two are very consistent. So finding customers and expanding internationally were the top 2 in 2019 as well.
And that's really interesting. That's the sort of data that I see and hear from EdTech founders and entrepreneurs across the country. And that is that there really is this really big desire to focus on customers. So it's nice to see that data. So maybe we jump into the actual data from the 2019, but I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, well, before we leave that, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is to note that there is still, even during this time, a really big shift from what we saw in 2017. So in 2017, far and away, the biggest challenge was finding investment. And I know, David, you and I will talk a little bit more about this later, but that really shows a shift in the types of organizations that we've got now. In 2017, it was very nascent. There were lots and lots of startups, not yet with proven products or proven sort of sustainable revenues. And in 2019, we really saw a really big shift in that, and that we've got a far bigger proportion of scale-ups now. So we might move off that and come back to some of the results later, but it's very, very interesting to see. So thank you for taking part in that. I think it would be really strange for us to talk to you about the 2019 results without talking about the seismic shift that's happened since we released those results. With 190, COVID has had obviously such a huge impact, 195 countries forced to close down schools nationwide and 1.5 billion learners affected. So we've seen education institutions have to rapidly respond to that and provide remote learning and be able to think about like access and equity with the digital divide. And also to be able to provide virtual support services. And we thought it would be interesting to just give you a bit of a snapshot from a couple of our EdTech organisations in Australia as to what that impact has had. I mean, I think we can imagine, but Vigo, for example, so Vigo, if you're not familiar with them, provide student support services in the higher education sector. And they saw an 800% increase in users this month compared to the same month last year, and 22 countries represented in their active users. Now, they were obviously on an upward trajectory in terms of usage and uptake anyway, but undoubtedly COVID's had a huge, huge impact on that. And then the other organisation that we spoke to Paul Lydiot from Education Horizons Group. And Education Horizons Group provide a really wide variety of EdTech solutions across schools. But one of those solutions is the My Ed Online platform, which provides distance learning. And they saw a 24% increase and uptake of that platform, with 120 schools added in just March alone. And one of the other things that they talked about saying is that a huge requirement to provide virtual support services to promote engagement and well-being with those students as well. So obviously, COVID has massively accelerated the EdTech trajectory. And one of the things I think that we will want to think about at the end of this period is how we might harness the learnings from these recent disruptions. But moving on now to the Australian EdTech Census of 2019. I thought it would be interesting to just start off and reflect on the fact that, I mean, whatever way we cut the data, the requirement for EdTech solutions is going to be an increasingly huge requirement by the year 2025, Deloitte Access Economics predicts there will be 1 billion students across 29 international markets, with 1 billion students worldwide actively seeking education skills. So, I mean, that's just looking at the international education market, and whether we think about like meeting those requirements for those students onshore or offshore, it's undoubtedly the case that EdTech solutions will be a huge part of what's required to provide education services to those students. But the second thing I think we need to think about is the significant role that EdTech plays in the Australian economy. Firstly, it's a critical enabler and differentiator of what was at the time of the census our third biggest export in the form of education services. And secondly, it's a globally relevant investment opportunity. So of those 600 organisations that are represented in the Australian EdTech sector, many of them have established customer bases overseas. They have very high potential in terms of potential investment opportunity in a growing market, and they are actively seeking investment. So 33% of respondents talked about actually the fact that they would be looking for investment within the next 12 months. And finally, I think the other thing to think about in terms of the role in the economy is as a creator of jobs. And of course, that is highly relevant right now and highly relevant going forwards in a sector which is looking to be growing and sustainable. So I think 18% of respondents in the 2019 survey said that they would be looking to hire within the next 6 months. Now, it'd be really interesting to see what comes back in our 2020 data when we conduct that survey later this month or next.
Before we jump on, Kristen, I will add the point there as well. This is a really important point about the EdTech sector in Australia. It is an export market today. Any established company that's generating millions of dollars worth of revenue, that's an EdTech company in Australia, is generating export revenue. And it's a really important point when we talk about the current situation of Australian economy globally, and the fact that we're talking about recovery and, you know, reintroduction plans. And the reality right now is the EdTech sector is growing and it's driving export revenue. So it is a nice point to remind ourselves, and also to remind all of our government partners who are with us today as well, that in fact a little bit more stimulus in the market might actually even grow that export market. But we'll talk about policy settings a bit later. We have Rebecca Hall with us.
So you nearly stole my thunder there, David, but yes.
Okay, I did steal a little bit of your thunder, but we'll get somewhere there, Rebecca. Thanks.
Absolutely, really good point, David. And David, maybe you want to just start to take us through some of the findings from the 2019 census.
Yeah, absolutely. And in essence, what I'd like to do is try and have this as a bit of a conversation with Christine. But I think that the four main points that we saw, and we've reiterated in the report, we're reiterating it here, and that is really it's the maturity. If you think about these four trends, we're talking about the maturity of the market, from startups to scale-ups. Is there a data point that we want to pull out and sort of highlight that growth, Christine?
I think there were several, actually several data points in the startup to scale up. I mean, first of all, there are higher percentages of revenues and higher revenues overall. Many of them have been in the market for longer, with more operational sustainability and proven products and overseas customers. So we really saw a really big shift from startups to scale-ups. And then I think even as we look at like the types of challenges that were presented in the data, you can see that there's again that shift in the types of challenges that you typically see in a startup when they're trying to just get off the ground, get their product up and running, get customers, to when they're really looking for investment as, you know, being the first priority, to seeing the priorities shift to being about actually looking for new customers, looking for new markets, about finding talent, which is far more the type of challenges you see in the scale-up phase.
Yeah, and if we think about this future of work, this is a really important global trend. There is a definite, I'm going to use a simple term, a land grab. There is a simple there is a definite shifting or merging, if you like, of the fact that EdTech companies are starting to merge into sort of HR tech and recruitment tech and skills tech. And it's really around that future of work. And globally, we're seeing lots of investment money there. We saw, I think, the same data in the Australian census as well, Christine. We saw many more companies identifying as future of work plays as opposed to traditional education provider plays.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so what we saw was quite a big shift in the types of solutions. So still you see schools and higher education being the number 1 and 2 in terms of solutions, but number 3 this time was corporate learning and vocational education services. So you know, that's one data point which shows that future of work gaining traction. And the other point is really, if you look at the organisations that gained the highest levels of international investment, they were predominantly in the future of work space. So players like Go1, players like a Cloud Guru were the types of solutions that got the highest levels of international funding. And that's a global trend.
Yeah, and that's actually a really important point too, because one of the interesting things about large companies like Go1, a Cloud Guru, and the Code Warrior, I think, is the other one that comes to mind as well. These are Australian education technology businesses that really are focused on new training and delivery models. And what it actually has done as well is it's reminded international investors that there's a really thriving Australian EdTech sector. So we're certainly seeing demand there as well. And it's a nice little segue into global expansion. And there's no doubt my travels speaking with EdTech leaders around the country and actually internationally as well, is that there is a really defined desire to start expanding the footprint that they sell to and the customers they acquire, and global expansion is certainly very much top of mind. Some data that might support that contention, Christine?
Yeah, so again, in terms of global, I mean, the interesting thing with Australia is our organisations, our EdTech organisations actually look to globally expand quite rapidly. So because we are a relatively strong but small market in and of ourselves, global expansion tends to be top of mind quite quickly. Even in the 2017 census, we saw 68% of the organisations surveyed had international customers. But this time we saw that increase to 77% of respondents.
I can't remember, but maybe we did or didn't in the data. Did we pull out the amount of revenue they're expecting from those international customers? It literally is a question off the top of my head. I just can't remember.
No, I don't think that's split out, but it's something that we might look to do in this survey.
Yeah, and there is a really important point here too, and that is that if you are to set a certain level of revenue, and we use the term early stage, late stage, and established company. If you're an EdTech company in that late stage and above, you are exporting. It's almost exclusively. I can't remember the exact number, but it was very, very high. Just a reminder to people that you can ask, you can dump questions in the Q&A and we'll come to them. If they're relevant as we see them, I'll certainly ask them. So let's talk a little bit about this challenge of shifting to new markets and finding talent, and how EdTech companies saw those as important things for their development, Christine.
Yeah, so I was talking a little bit as we were doing the poll. So in the first census in 2017, far and away the greatest challenge, the biggest challenge that the majority of, or that got the highest number of respondents rather in 2017 was finding investment. This time the 1, 2 and 3 were, so number 1 at 26% was finding new customers being the biggest challenge. And the number 2 and 3 tied was global expansion at 18% and finding talent at 18%. So that's why it was pretty interesting to do the poll at the beginning of this session and see that the top 2 remained, and that finding investment sort of crept up there again, as we all know that we're just going through a very challenging time at the moment.
And I can't let the opportunity go past, Christine. We have some economic development people from government on our call today. So I just want to talk about the fact that skilled employment development, whether it's in the EdTech sector or another, whether they're people focused on machine learning, on artificial intelligence, or, you know, the Internet of Things and all of these tools. These skilled workforces are really important for the EdTech sector, and that skilled workforce is transferable between them. I've actually got two questions which I think are really relevant to this position, Christine, so I wanted to just quickly talk about them. Sarah has asked, how long is it taking for EdTech companies to go overseas? I'll ask you technically, I can give anecdotally, but technically, did we actually do that in the data? I don't remember.
We don't, but it's certainly a question that might be interesting to add. I would point out that a lot of the organisations that are now at the sort of mature end and really growing rapidly have probably been around since for 2 to 3 years. So, for example, the two that we quoted earlier, Vigo and Education Horizons, started in 2016. So that sort of 2 to 3 year phase seems to be quite significant.
I think that's true. I think that in the EdTech sector to grow, my anecdotal comment here would be, to grow internationally, there are two sort of models that companies really look at. One is they go to English-speaking markets because they want to maximise return on investment for their product for their primary market. So you see lots of EdTech startups looking for the US and the UK for two reasons. One, it supports their expansion because they don't have to necessarily build new products. But what they also are doing is that typically to attract investment from those countries, they need to have a local customer base. So we're seeing that. I'd also argue that there are a spectrum. I think the EdTech sector is no different to others in terms of how quickly it can go overseas. But I think that there is a spectrum. There are some companies that automatically start thinking internationally, and there are two companies that come to mind. One is Taliesin, which is a health provider, and they work almost exclusively online. I don't think they have any domestic customers. They're focused almost exclusively internationally. And the other one is Royal ABC by Sydney-based Prosper Education. They're again specifically focused in an international market. Let's have a quick look here. We talked about the fact that global expansion was a challenge. Did we drill down into those challenges, understanding legislation, country, trademarks, legislation? I don't think we did.
Again, we have a bit of a flavour of some of the challenges, but we haven't explicitly dug down into the challenges, if that makes sense. So it would be something that would be very interesting to do, and it certainly comes up time and again in the case studies as well. Okay.
We might move on to some more data, and there's a couple of other questions, but I think we may have to answer them offline later.
Okay.
We'll move on.
Okay, great. So the next slide, I just think it's really interesting to pause and think about the fact, I mean, this is true of all technology-based sectors, that as technology evolves, the underlying technologies change, and what's possible within those technology sectors changes alongside that. I just thought it was really interesting to look at, these are some of the key technologies we see emerging at the moment in EdTech. So blockchain, learning analytics, artificial intelligence, digital reality, API economy. And one statistic that I think is very interesting is that artificial intelligence-based solutions globally in 2016 made up about 4% of global EdTech solutions. In 2019, that shifted to be 20%. So quite a big increase. And I think the thing that we need to be quite considered and thoughtful about with EdTech is the changes in what we're actually doing with it. So moving from being, I say just an enabler to actually being a differentiator and actually changing the way that we can deliver and what we can do with education services. So the combination of great teaching and great EdTech just shifts and evolves all the time. So then we need to be really thoughtful and considered about what role we want the EdTech sector to have economically, but also within education services, and what role we want the Australian EdTech sector to have. And so just rounding out this section before I hand over and we hear from Rebecca Hall, the two things I think to reflect on are, what role do we want the EdTech market to have? One, economically, and then also within our schools and higher ed organisations and better organisations and within the workplace? And secondly, how can we harness the innovations that have occurred during this disrupted time?
Can we just, before we move on, can we just go back for 1 second, Sophia? I'd like to add a couple of other things in here. We've got a little bit of time and there may be some other questions that come in, so I remind everyone, if you've got a question, please dump it into the Q&A box and we'll do it. I think it's really important to really talk about Australia's place within the global economy. There's no doubt education is digitising, right? It's moving online, it's moving borderless. It doesn't mean it's going to be one or the other, it's going to be replaced. And I think with the COVID pandemic situation as well, it's almost important for us to think about how do we enable this export market to move faster and to develop faster, Christine. And I'll talk very briefly about that. I certainly think that there are things that we can do as a country that can help take Australian education offshore without necessarily bringing people onshore, and we can impact learners around the world. And there are some policy settings we need to look at, but essentially my view here is that the EdTech sector is sort of essential into that innovation, education innovation piece. It's not necessarily tech just for the sake of it. And I acknowledge the 5 points you're making before about those tech, but they're really enablers of digital transformation or something much broader than that. And I know I'm preaching to the converted here. And you're right.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing with that is, yes, those are the underpinning technologies, but it changes what we can do. So rather than just thinking about taking face-to-face learning and putting it online, we can start to think and be really thoughtful about what we can do that goes above and beyond that and makes the lives of our teachers easier, and actually enables them to get even better education outcomes as well. So, you know, when you think about things like being able to use learning by questions via an EdTech solution, then you are actually able to enable really powerful education outcomes.
There's no doubt about that. Go, sorry.
And I think it's really timely and a great opportunity now for us to really think about, like, what role do we want to have economically and globally, and then what role do we want our EdTech sector to have locally within our education services? Yeah,
absolutely. Christine, thank you so very much for sharing the details of the data with us today and Deloitte's insights into where the sector is going to go and the impact on education. And I'm really looking forward to working with you over the next couple of years as strategic partner to take the data, and we can add some more of these things. We'll come back for some Q&A in a minute. So thanks very much, Christine.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks very much for joining us, Rebecca. Really looking forward to it. And I'll hand over to you to talk, and we've got some things that we can add into the conversation as we go.
Indeed, I wanted to take myself off mute quite a bit in that earlier conversation because great questions and of course a great data set to build from. And even though I've got a slide deck, given what I just heard from the update, I did want to start actually with how Austrade during COVID and as part of our transformation has made some organisational changes that actually fit exactly with what the census has shown us. So I'm here representing I'm the head of International Education Centre of Excellence, and that is one of 8 centres of excellence across Austrade. The 5 or 6 technical domains that were uncovered in the census and that Christine just spoke about, they're actually sitting within our Advanced Technology Centre of Excellence. So you have 2 roles here in Australia that have a global leadership role across our network. And I think it's why I chose this bit of a corny title, but I'm here in Queensland and the sun is shining. But I really do think this is our time for Australia's EdTech to shine. And anyone knows nothing is an overnight success. I know the work that's gone into from even EduGrowth's formation, but also many of our companies that maybe didn't even start out in the EdTech space, but are now indeed operating there. All those others that you spoke about in terms of Born Global. That's another group of companies, I guess, that, you know, Austrade's really refocusing its efforts on. How do we support those companies traditionally in the tech space who are born global, who are not waiting to go to an export market, but who are, that is their #1 target. So for those of you that don't know me, although I have seen there's quite a few Austraders on the call and also other colleagues from other levels of government. And I think that is a sign to, David, as you said, to shift our thinking away from the traditional model, particularly of international ed, and into, or international students, I should say, into a broader and more inclusive approach. So I've got a few slides to share today.
Yep, you tell me when you want me to move them.
You can also interrupt me. As I say, you can also interrupt me at any time, David, if questions come through. And this next slide, you gave a preview of it, but we'll move to it. I'm sure many of you have seen this come across your LinkedIn or Twitter, and I had a good laugh at it when I first saw it, but I actually was also just saw one of the questions or the comments there as well, talking about the challenge in some of our traditional institutions. I think the word was used is academic arrogance. I would hope it's not the primary way of being, but I do think if we look at our universities and our education sector and how they've been able to pivot to a digital transformation that would not have been possible or even thought of last year. And so one of the things that we're looking at is how do we take these gains? How do we learn from the quick wins and the adaptation that was delivered during COVID, and how do we make sure that we sustain it for the ongoing benefit, obviously, for the learner, for our institutions, for our EdTech companies, and as you both outlined, for our global economy and society. I'll move to the next slide though, which is more focused on, I guess, Australia's overall response. I am coming at this from an international education perspective, but in Austrade's definition, and I think increasingly in how people see our sector, we are one and the same, and that our technology partners, our suppliers, and those who are delivering services enable us to do what we're doing. There's a lot of information here, so just the fast facts, which I'm sure people are aware of, but 480,000 student holders here in Australia now, many of whom who are studying online, 20% of our visa holders still outside Australia. Obviously, from a reputation perspective, how we've managed health and governance has been perceived as world leading, and we put our New Zealand colleagues in that same bubble or that same vein. As I mentioned, the transition to online, of course, huge effort by our institutions, but also many of them in partnership with EdTech service providers and local homegrown providers. I do think our history in online and distance education is something that we need to build on further, and something that stands Australia in good stead for how we can sustain these efforts. And also the work of our regulators. We know that for many of you, and I know it was one of the questions in the census, the challenges of government regulation. Some of the changes that we've seen in key markets, not necessarily permanently, but certainly with how China recognised online, or is working to recognise that with our regulators, pretty impressive. I know that India is another market that we're in deep conversations with.
Can I just add in there as well, Rebecca, just because I think it's a really important point for our EdTech entrepreneurs who are with us today as well. At times we can think regulation is a stymie to innovation, but in fact, what we saw, there were two really important regulatory things that happened very, very quickly. One, as Rebecca has just said, which was around the recognition within international jurisdictions such as China. I think it's working on India right now to allow education to move online. And I think people may not be fully aware that there were direct channels set up between Australia's government and China's government to be able to allow providers to cross firewalls in really quick time. Like, these are big policy changes and regulatory changes that only really government can enact. So there was a real leadership role there that I think maybe was hidden a little bit, because there's no doubt that there are a lot of really intelligent people pulling together to make that happen. And we saw lots of students being able to get online delivery across a firewall, which was almost impenetrable up until COVID situation arrived. Can I ask you to think for a second, Rebecca, about where do you see the sort of opportunities for partnership between EdTech and education providers that may have come out of the COVID situation before we move on? And there are a number of questions to that, which I'll answer sort of as we get into a panel conversation in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
So I just thought you might want to touch on that.
Definitely. I think Vigo is one example that was listed earlier on. I have them as one of my case
I'll
studies
jump forward if you like.
further on.
Yeah.
So I think obviously, and also open learning. So our platform providers who are helping institutions get their micro-credentials, short courses or full programs online. And obviously I've got an image here of open learning, an Australian homegrown innovator in that space. I think for institutions, recruitment and student acquisition, I think we've moved very quickly to virtual events. I'd suggest we've probably not got that right yet, and there's some more opportunities there, also around peer-to-peer learning and peer-to-peer referrals. I think the Vigo example, there's a number of others that actually I've come across in your work and some earlier pitch nights too, around mental health and well-being and pastoral care and support. And then of course we've got our large number of providers who, one of the figures I had on that earlier slide about the 1.6 million learners outside of a classroom, 198 countries and 91% of the world outside of a classroom. So organisations like, I've forgotten what they're called. They're right there in front of me.
Are you looking at MathSpace?
Sorry,
MathSpace.
MathSpace.
Yeah.
MathSpace. I use them.
Okay.
I do think with anything that we're doing in international education as well, and for us even as an Australian government and state governments who are trying to create the right environment for a successful international education sector, or global education sector I should say, EdTech also offers us great opportunities to better measure return on investment and to better track programs and initiatives. And I think you're going to find government wanting to, government very interested in how we can continue to do that and what role we may play even as procurement partners or pilot partners as well.
I wanted to ask you a couple of questions actually, if I can, Rebecca. I just wanted to jump in. I wanted to ask quickly, really two questions. The first one is, obviously education is moving digital and borderless and online, and Australia's had a sort of a branding position of study in Australia, and I know that there's some work being done there. Did you want to talk about that? I think you've got a slide here somewhere. Sorry, I'll just jump up and down until I find it for you.
I do. No. That's perfect. Yep. Go the next one. Next one.
Is this one?
That one.
Yes. Yes. This one. Sorry.
There. Yes. 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 Absolutely. And I've heard this from a lot of partners and people saying we were planning this work already pre-COVID, but obviously as we entered 2020, we really accelerated a number of our projects. And Austrade has been leading a piece of work, and actually EduGrowth, I know, was formed out of that work back in 2016 around what a diverse international education sector would look like, and having a bigger focus on borderless education, on the use of technology. And so one of the simple ways we looked at it last year, as other parts of Australian government were developing a nation brand, was what would it look like to take our proposition from solely study in Australia to study with Australia. Now, we don't mean that to be our brand tagline. Don't worry, that's not what we're leading with, but that's the frame that we're trying to introduce when we're talking across government, when we're thinking about policy, when we're working with other clients in this EdTech space. Around one, as you asked, our onshore traditional international education model is enabled by EdTech and Australian innovation, but huge opportunities as well to be more inclusive around transnational, online, and of course all the other programs that are available through Australian technology. So I'll go to the next slide, which I hope shows some of the example. I mean, even in this deck that I'm using now, you may notice some new green and gold, some new look and feel for how the Australian government is starting to present our capabilities. And so we do have this year the opportunity to use the nation brand assets, and particularly for us to work to highlight the unique Australian approach to EdTech and online. We've been doing a small pilot with FutureLearn and with Australian content, short courses and micro-credentials there, and just starting to test what types of learners are interested in our content. As you well know, David, we have a partnership with EduGrowth to also develop some further case studies and content as well around our EdTech providers. So I do think, yeah, building on our branded reputation for our technology and our education is a huge opportunity we have under the nation brand.
And that might be a really nice segue to talk about the broader export opportunity, and then we'll invite Christine back in a minute. We'll answer these questions we've got in the Q&A box. And I think you've got a slide, am I right? I think there was.
I think so too, yes. Well, I think this one, if we build from that and acknowledging many of my Austrade colleagues on the webinar or listening later on, we actually, I've been with Austrade 2 years now, and I'm blown away by the talent we have in our global network and how quickly the network has moved to support EdTech. And as I mentioned, how our reorganisation is also going to enable some more of that. This slide actually shows from our work last year with our each of our regions, priority markets for EdTech opportunities. Now, these are our internal markets where we are prioritising efforts and being proactive in our engagement. I think if you were to ask me about the top 4 markets where capital might come from, where customers might come from, I would say China obviously has been a big part of our EdTech growth, the US, and we have a strong team there in the US. Europe tends to be bundled as a whole, but interestingly, I think the latest data that I saw from Whole on IQ, using venture capital and investment as a proxy as well, India is not far behind. So I think now post-COVID, there may be some interesting shifts. We've heard great things out of the UAE in terms of how they're embracing EdTech and also their value that they put on Australian companies as well. So I think this is probably something which is unique to obviously each company and the work that the census has uncovered as well, the size and the maturity of the company as well.
Yeah, there's no doubt the point you make there about India is really important, and that is I think the Whole on IQ data, as you said, suggests that it's an it's a bit of a sleeping giant, and it's moving really quickly. Obviously, with companies like Baiju, which are Indian-based, and I think now the largest, if not the largest, certainly one of the top 2 or 3 EdTech companies in the world in terms of valuation. Yep. It's an important market that's growing, and this might be a really nice segue to ask Christine to turn her camera on and rejoin us. And there are a bunch of questions here. Some of them are really sort of probably for me, but
David,
as a group, yeah.
Can I just jump back in? I did have an India example there as well.
Yeah, of course.
And I know you're interested in policy. Obviously, the virtual summit between India and Australia, our prime ministers, the first virtual summit that I think I've seen in my lifetime, and the commitment that we have across our countries, linking that to the India economic strategy as well, and education as the flagship. That doesn't say we should keep doing what we're doing and just continue to grow onshore. It talks about the need to change, to enter new partnerships and to deliver common value across Australia and India. So yeah, I do think a fantastic opportunity, and our all the way from the highest level with our Prime Ministers acknowledging that.
And here's a great question actually for you, Rebecca, whilst we're on it. And that is, the question is from Tom, and it says, how should an Australian EdTech company engage with Austrade to penetrate the priority offshore markets? Is there a process or key contact?
There is indeed, and as I mentioned, we are reorganising ourselves, and that also means reviewing our services as well. I do think I've got a slide at the back as well, which looks some of the services that we can offer, but people can access those later on if you want to. Certainly those countries that I listed as priorities have EdTech leads and trade commissioners or business development managers who will be able to work directly with you. We are trialling some new services which are unique to a number of companies, and EdTech clients are part of that new service design as well. But ultimately, I would say visiting austrade.gov.au. I know that's, it's a website, we can all go to a website, but there is, it is our vision that we actually are including more information for self-service as well for clients to get the information that they need. But I will just unpack, because I think it was really interesting and great that you did the poll again today on the #1 priority, which was finding customers still, and some of the services that Austrade offers. Obviously, market selection is one, unique to your own organisation. So we're not just going to come out and say India if it's not the right market for your product or your company. Identification of potential contacts, buyers, customers, test partners. Market entry and expansion. We have a lot of companies who are coming back to us, having entered successfully one market and now wanting to diversify, particularly following COVID. Diversification was always important. It's now front and centre. And of course, direct opportunity engagement as it arises, because our network is very connected to either, government programming and plans, or individual corporate opportunities as well.
And you can't do it, but I can. But to all of the EdTech entrepreneurs that are on this call, you get back from entities like Austrade and your economic development agencies in your state departments as much as you put in. You actually need to have a strategic engagement plan with them. You need to strategically go out there and define a program of how you engage them and work out what they understand in their market and how they can help you. It's not, it doesn't happen by osmosis. You need to actively, you need to consider it as a strategic component of the business to be able to grow using these export agencies. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit more about demand. And I don't know whether or not we can talk too much about this, but there is a question here, which is a really interesting question. I'm not sure that we can do it though, Christine, from the data we have, or we put it into future data. We can certainly talk anecdotally. And that is, the question really is around, do we think that there's more demand in certain sectors? Is it universities? Is it TAFE? Is it micro-credentials? Do we have an insight for that? I know we probably have some anecdotal, but I don't think the data, we collected data on it, did we, Christine?
Look, this sort of is. I mean, I think to an extent how the Australian EdTech sector breaks down gives you a bit of an indication of that. And we do have some data. I don't have it to hand easily, but I can do it after this, is like the amount that's spent in different sectors. So still the majority of spending is actually from schools and higher ed, if you add it all up. So that's why you see the top two solutions, if I just bring them up. So secondary schools are 60%, so 60% of EdTech organisations in Australia have a solution focused on secondary schools. And then the reason why these, they can answer to more than one, because lots of organisations target solutions at more than one sector. Primary schools are the second with 58%, and universities 55%, and then vocational, and then corporate. So I think you can actually break down and look at the figures that underpin like how much spend there is per sector.
There are 2 or 3 questions that are along a similar theme, and I feel like I should answer them. And the question really is around the challenge associated with finding those first customers and connecting to them. And I agree with the comments from Beverly, Tom, Mark, which are really around questions about the challenges with how do you have, in a time of crisis, people are going to be starting to thinking about shedding budgets as opposed to expanding budgets. And it's one of those things that I'm not sure that there's an immediate fix for it. I certainly have some policy positions that EduGrowth has been advocating for a while. There's a document that we called Enabling the Education Technology Sector in Australia, the EdTech ecosystem. We've just recently written another paper called Rising with the Challenge, which is still in private use. And really it's around about how do we incentivize both local customers but also international customers. And I think you'll see some work being done there. I won't sort of add more than that. I don't think that we can add more comments there. I think that they're certainly very, very true. I guess we've got time because we have a bit of a, well, I have a particular rule at EduGrowth. We finish on time, so we don't take up other people's time. So we've got 5 minutes left. So I wanted to try and find the juiciest question because there are so many questions coming in. I want to find the one that I think is going to be really cool to answer. The one that we can't really answer, but we can just leave as a thought pattern. Let me just have a quick look here.
David, while you're looking, can I pick up on the role of state and territory governments? I saw
absolutely.
A question there, and some people on the call might know I have worked for Victorian government and Queensland government previously, and what I'm seeing now is a real maturity of our state governments and their understanding of what role EdTech can play, not just as a standalone industry area or a technology solution, but as an enabler to rebuilding a more sustainable international education sector. So one of the links in my deck, which we can share later on, includes some infographics about each of the state and territories' individual programs to support businesses. And there was one question there also about, well, if money is drying up, if people are, if resources aren't there, how are we going to engage or bring on new suppliers? I think there is a role at varying levels, and we're seeing and hearing some great ideas from chief entrepreneurs and others at the state level who might be interested in prioritising this.
Fantastic. I am very conscious of time, so what I might do is I might use this as an opportunity to thank you, Rebecca, for coming and joining us. Thank you, Christine, for sharing the data there. It's really important too that I acknowledge there's a Deloitte consultant who worked incredibly hard on the EdTech Census, Adnan. I can't pronounce his surname though off the top of my head. I can't recall it. Christine, what was his name?
Rajkavala.
Okay. Adnan, and I think he's actually in the call, so I do wanted to say thank you because he did a great amount of work to pull the report together, and in great organizational style. We're a startup, and Deloitte's a significant corporation. You responded in our time frame as well, which is really cool to be able to work on those really fast response times. So I wanted to thank you all of you for your contribution. I want to thank everybody who's joined us. I will say that we'll have the slide decks available. They'll be sent out to people who participated. There'll be a recording of this will also be on the EduGrowth website. So we're looking forward to putting out some 2020 update and seeing what the impact of COVID has done on the EdTech sector, and building the case for additional government stimulus and support and driving innovation. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Rebecca, thanks, Christine. Thanks, Sophia.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Great conversation, David. Thank you.
Thank you.